is a threat to healthy black fatherhood in America. Bibi Fahodie, this is Baba Jahi. I'm here in an unusual video because usually when we do videos, we do it together, me and Mama Jahi. But in this video, I felt it was particularly important that I do it as an offering to my brothers. So meaning this video is designed to appeal more to my brothers than the sisters. But if there are any sisters watching this, I would, urge them to share this video with the men in their lives, whether that's their husbands, their sons, uncles, grandparents, because this is a video in which I'm attempting to explore something that is haunted us as black men since the Ma'afa, and that's what I call confused manhood. And the subtitle of this video is The Social Attack on Black Fathers. Now, much like Mama Jahi's videos, in this video, I have notes. So while I'm talking, if you see me look off screen, that's because I'm looking at my notes and just so I can stay on topic. But again, the title of this video is Confused Manhood, The Social Attack on Black Fathers. All right. So before we get into the topic, I want to put a few disclaimers out there. And one is I'm making this video as a compliment to Mama Jahi's video on Barbie and mother-daughter relationships. If you go to Mama Jahi, that's my wife. If you go to her profile, she made a lengthy video talking about the mother-daughter relationships and how Barbie culture feeds into that. This video is the counterpart for the men. Basically, how are we thinking of ourselves as men based on our existence within a westernized culture? The second disclaimer is black men in America are in a state of crisis and are in need of African inspiration. Notice I said African inspiration and not American inspiration or Moorish inspiration or Israelite inspiration. No, African, meaning we have to go to that deepest source, the source of our genetic ancestors, which is the continent of Africa. Next, this talk is an appeal to black men and African familyhood and an attack on white society ideologies with our African ancestors. All right. Next, fatherhood is the highest embodiment of our power for African men, and husbandhood is just a gateway to fatherhood. So this is entertaining the notion that when you get married, the marriage is consummated by the birth of that child. And this is why in African traditions, if a child wasn't born within that 2-year period after being married, it will often lead to divorce. So we're talking about manhood from that perspective, manhood being linked to our ability to assert ourselves as fathers, all right? And lastly, just as Mama Jahi said, this video is not for you if you're a part of the It Ain't That Deep University, okay? We all know those people. You try to explain something and go into depth and they say it ain't that deep. If you're a member of that university, this is not the video for you, and just politely log out. So now that those disclaimers are out the way, let's get into definitions, okay? Because definitions that give us the grounding so that everything that comes after, we know what our goal is, what our shared goal is. So what is confused manhood? All right, so confused manhood is the socially engineered byproduct of the psychological and physical torture of black males with the intent to stop the transition from boyhood to manhood, which is rites of passage, and or to bring about our genetic annihilation. And lastly, confused manhood keeps us in a state of chronic underdevelopment, okay? Notice I use the word underdevelopment. This is also a term that Mama Jahi used in her concept of fragile femininity. And when we're talking about underdevelopment, we're talking about that blockage, meaning that transition from that boy state or that child state to the adult state is somehow interrupted. And through interrupting that transition from boyhood to manhood, what's happening is our enemies are implanting new characteristics to keep us in a perpetual state of boyhood, to keep us in a perpetual state of dependency so that we can assert our power as Africans. So when we're talking about confused manhood, this is a form of underdevelopment, a form of spiritual, psychological, and physical attack, okay? And once we understand that, everything else I say will start to make more sense. And if you want to ascribe a character to this confused male, just think of the character of the Sambo. And a Sambo is a black person, specifically a black male, especially one who is accommodating or servile towards whites, okay? And so whenever we're talking about confused manhood, one of the trademarks of confused manhood is all of their actions, whether conscious or subconscious, they're going to benefit our enemies, meaning they're going to benefit the white man, the white woman, and the white child, okay? And a manhood that is anchored in its Africanness is always going to lead to an outcome where African families are eating. African men, women, and children are benefiting from that behavior, all right? So quickly, I'm just going to read out a list of symptoms and risk factors for confused manhood. And I'm going to read through these quickly, and if you have any like confusion or question marks about one of the symptoms I read, just, hold that, because what you'll notice is as I go through this talk, it'll become more clear why these are symptoms or risk factors, okay? So the first symptom of confused manhood is the inability to forcefully condemn homosexuality, lesbianism, or transgenderism, okay? The second is thinking homosexuals are redeemable because of their money, and I would add whites as well, okay? Another symptom, a hostile response to anything African. Another symptom, white male friends or female friends, and marrying, reproducing, or dating a white woman, okay? Another symptom, chronic negative self-talk, and this diminishes your self-esteem. And one of the common forms of negative self-talk you see black men engage in is calling ourselves niggas. You see, if we talk about ourselves in the first person and we call ourselves a nigga, that's a sign of confused manhood. Another sign of confused manhood is suicidal ideation. When you're suicidal, participating in activities that would classify as invited suicide, like daredevil things, like riding motorcycles, drinking excessively, doing things that you know could possibly lead to your demise. This is also a form of confused manhood. Engaging in forms of brotherhood that do not celebrate or encourage being a husband or a father, okay? Treating your son like a peer instead of giving them the necessary guidance in life, and this is the fun dad, okay? Next, we have not being breastfed as an infant. This is a risk factor, okay? So meaning while we aren't responsible for feeding ourselves as infants, if we were deprived of that breast in our infancy, remember that's a critical emotional cultural transfer that we missed. And because of that, we can carry a level of bond damage throughout our life that manifests in the form of confused manhood. Next, equating income with masculine power and thinking money is the most valuable form of providing. Okay, I'm going to talk about non-monetary forms of contribution in this, okay? Because this is, when we're talking about African forms of manhood, these are not monetary categories. These are categories about villagehood and how we contribute to that village, okay? Next, looking at children as liabilities and not our greatest technology. And lastly, the suspicion of black women as enemies and not complements to black men, okay? So these are all the symptoms and risk factors of confused manhood. All right, so now we're going to talk about the origins. Whenever I do a talk, I'm a history kind of buff, I guess you could call it. So I love history. I love African history specifically. So I think whenever we're talking about things, if we don't provide that historical context, we're always going to be walking away with a sense of incompleteness, like, okay, I see the problem, but I don't really know how to solve it. So one of the ways we solve our problems is we first have to identify what's the source. And that source is located in our historical memory. Okay, so what is the origin of confused manhood? So confused manhood originated on the plantations of America, where white enslavers tortured African men in the presence of their families. Some of the torture methods that were used was breaking at the rack, quartering, the whipping post, the pit, bloodhounds, brainwashing, rape, stock breeding, and miscegenation were all used to confuse our notions of manhood. Okay, this is that institution of buck breaking that we've all heard about. And these buck breaking plantations were very common in the Caribbean. In fact, it was said that in order to gain entry into America, you first had to pass through that buck breaking process in the Caribbean, which means that the vast majority of African males in America are descendants of men who were spiritually broken by these, torturers, by these white torturers in their process of our enslavement. So whenever we address our history, we have to address that genetic memory and say, okay, even though we're proud Africans and we come from an origin of Africanity, we also have to acknowledge that our immediate ancestors was tortured and they was ripped from that African source, okay? So next we have the destruction of the extended family model of indigenous Africa and the replacement of nuclear family set the stage for the confusion of black manhood. So in the African concept of familyhood, what you had was the village, the parents, the extended mothers, and that's the other women in the community who help rear the children, the children themselves and the ancestors. So notice in the extended family model, you have 5 elements. Okay, let's go over them again. You got the village, the parents, the extended mothers, the children, and the ancestors. Meanwhile, in the white nuclear family, all you have is the mother, the father, and the child. You see, so it's 3/5 of what the African family was. And because of that broken family structure, the man now, he was unmoored, meaning he did not have a way to contextualize his existence, because in Africa, our existence was based on our relationship to that village, to those ancestors. But once you take that village away, once you take that ancestor away, once you take that extended mother away, now we're what? We're looking for identity and we can't find it, okay? So this is just highlighting how the environments we live in and the culture we live in, how we're socialized, this all what influences how we think of ourselves as men and how we respond to threats, all right? So next, we're going to talk about African men and white men are irreconcilably different. Okay, so one thing that I like to do when I try to understand things at a deeper level is I want to break down, okay, if African men, if our goal is to assert our power, what are the 3 realms of power in which we, behave? Or what are the 3 realms of power in which we're acting? And I would say the 3 realms of power are, you have an economic realm, you have a spiritual realm, and then you have the domestic realm, okay? And whether you're white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Spanish, whatever you are, and whenever you're classifying a people and you want to find out how they exercise their power, you want to say, okay, how do they operate in the economic realm, how they operate in the spiritual realm, and how they operate in the domestic realm. Domestic means in the household, okay? So when we're talking about white people, historically, and mind you, I'm talking about the historical origins of people. When we talk about the 3 realms of power for white men specifically, in the economic realm, whites are pirates. Another way of saying that is they're thieves. I call them hunter pirates. These are people who are parasites. They go into areas that are full of abundance and they steal, kill, and destroy. Okay, so economically, the white man asserts his power through piracy. And we also know this about the Greek pirating of the Kemetic wisdom, okay? These are all forms of what? Leashing off of the abundance of others, okay? In the spiritual realm, the white ancestor is the missionary or the Jesuit. This is the one who came in raping, indoctrinating Africans to disown their rituals, to disown their gods, to disown divinations, to disown the African woman who is the priestess in the African spiritual system. So when we're talking about the ancestor of the whites, in terms of their spiritual power, we're talking about missionaries. We're talking about Jesuits, okay? What they call the war dogs of Christ, okay? And then lastly, in the domestic realm, the white man is a tyrant, meaning he has absolute rule over the women and the children in the home, and it's unchallenged, meaning it's a patriarchal order from top to bottom, okay? So that's the 3 realms of power for the white man. Economically, he's a pirate. Spiritually, he's a missionary. And domestically, he's a tyrant. Now, and all this falls under the category of the white man is obsessed with the protection of his possessions, okay? Meaning the protection of material, the protection of property. This is why they exist in capitalist societies, because property for them is what they feel that gives them their power, how much property they own. Okay, now let's look at the African side of things. Okay, within the African society, in the economics realm, we operate as builders, okay? That means we're using our hands, we're using our vision, we're using our intellect, and we're trying to build off of that vision with our hands, meaning we would build structures that people could store things in, structures that people could live in, structures to protect the commons, meaning to protect the harvest, to protect the livestock, to protect our children. We were builders, we were masons, and we were built from stone as well. Stone, clay, wood, that the building energy of the African man was unparalleled, okay? In the spiritual realm, we were Ngangas, or sometimes they'll call them priests, okay? And the priest's job was to give divinations. Think Orunmila in Yoruba tradition, or think, any other, prophet or any other person who was using their connection to the divine to restore order where there was disorder. So in the spiritual realm, we operated as priests. And lastly, within the household, domestically, we operated as babas or asafo. And asafo is just a Akan term for a militant warrior who guarded the perimeter of the village to make sure that enemies could not come in and corrupt our systems of social order and our systems of sustenance, okay? And while the whites were protectors of possessions, the African man was the protector of the family, meaning the African man's concept of wealth was embedded in his concept that he was a father, meaning he had a family to protect. And children, the more children he had, the more wealthy he was. And this is why in African societies, traditionally, you saw like polygamous families, because for Africans, the bigger the family, the more the wealth. In European society, the more property, the more wealth, okay? So these are just drawing some differences in culture between the white man and the African man. And if you understand these differences in culture, then you'll also understand the differences in our concepts of manhood, okay? So next, and I hope you all are following me, if I'm moving too fast, it's because it's a lot, and I just want to make sure that I cover a lot of ground, okay? So with the Romans, they had a concept that pretty much captures their concept of fatherhood, and they called it patrias potestas, and that translates as power of the father. Okay, and I'm going to read out a brief passage which kind of explains to you what this notion meant within Roman society. So it says, the Roman father was a powerful type because he possessed almost unlimited powers within the family, according to later Roman law. He had the power of life and death over his children, meaning that at the birth, he could choose to raise them or kill them, and later he could punish them by execution. Okay, so this is why I say domestically, the white man functions as a tyrant, because they say he has absolute power, unchallenged power over the family to the point where he can kill the child upon birth and the wife. This is unheard of in Africa, because in Africa, the women were the cultural administrators. The women were the agriculturalists. The women were bearing the children, teaching the children, running the marketplace. It was so many domains of power for the women within African society that it was unthinkable for us to even raise our hand against them, much less kill them. Okay? So when we're talking about the Roman concept of fatherhood, this is a rights-based concept, meaning it's selfish. It doesn't attend to what my responsibility is to others. It just says, how do I feed myself? How do I maximize my power at the expense of my wife and at the expense of my children and at the expense of everyone else in the village, okay? And one way you can see this concept of the rights of the father, in Rome is what they call exposure. And this is when they would take infants to the top of a hill in Rome and leave them, to be devoured by the beast of the forest. And if they came back to that hilltop and the baby was still there, then they would take that baby and then just put them into sex slavery, okay? And this was also practiced through the Roman institution of mentorship. And mentorship was this practice within Greco-Roman culture where men would give their sons to older men in order for them to be raped, because that raping of the child was seen as the prerequisite to make them a student where they could then be taught philosophy, okay? And all this is explained in great detail in a book by Walimu Baruti called Homosexuality and the Effeminization of Black Males. So when we're talking about Roman concepts of fatherhood, there's always this aspect of predatory activity, this aspect of preying on children and preying on women to maximize the power of the man, okay? So what is the African concept of father, now that we described the Roman concept of father? So I think the African concept of fatherhood can be contextualized in a proverb that I love. And the proverb states, it takes the breast for a child to know its mother, and it takes a mother for the child to know its father, okay? Let me read that again. It takes the breast for a child to know its mother, and it takes a mother for a child to know its father. So you see already immediately within the African concept of fatherhood, they're saying my identity as a father is completely reliant upon my relationship with the mother and the child. Meaning, and not only that, but the mother is defining what the father is. Meaning, but by her description of the father to the child, she's legitimizing the authority of the father. So you see how within the African context, what you have is a communal idea of fatherhood. An idea of fatherhood where the father isn't a tyrant, but he's an asset. He's a protector. He's a provider. He's a builder, as I like to say. He's someone who is creating a sheltering for the family to develop, okay? So immediately what we see is while the Yorugu, or the white concept of fatherhood, is rights-based, the African concept of fatherhood is responsibility-based, meaning you define yourself as a father based on how well are you fulfilling your responsibilities. And I will even add to this that fatherhood on the continent is both spiritual and political. And this is why in Tanzania, Julius Nyerere is called Baba wa Taifa, which means the father of the nation. And motherhood is also a political power position. And in Western society, these power positions of motherhood and fatherhood have been bastardized to the point that these prestigious roles, they're now seen as burdens. Okay, but remember, we have to search through our genetic memory and say, okay, even though Western society is teaching us that fatherhood is a burden, motherhood is a burden, like we don't care about them kids, all these kind of very callous statements that people come up with to undermine the importance of fatherhood. We have to understand these are foreign imports. And if we actually tap back into our African origins, we'll see that fatherhood is not just a high position, but it is the highest position, okay? So I gave the historical origins of confused manhood, and we talked about some of the cultural differences between Yorugus and Africans. Now what I want to focus in on is more biologically, what is the origin of this confused manhood? And I will argue that breastfeeding is the foundation of healthy boyhood. And this is all covered in my book, The Father Trimester, the pivotal role of the black father in breastfeeding. And in this book, I basically talk about how we as fathers, we have to understand that how we relate to the women in our lives during the perinatal period, this is going to shape how we develop as men. Meaning, and it's more pivotal than any other period, because it's at this point that not only is our wife vulnerable, but our child is vulnerable as well. So we have to understand how we respond, how we behave when we're in an environment where there's a vulnerability present. How do we assert ourselves as protectors? That's going to set the stage, set the tone for how we're going to act as protectors as that child matures past boyhood into manhood. So that's just the first thing I want to say before I get into the points. All right. So the first point I want to say is that severing us from the breast of our mothers during infancy deprives us of the emotional foundation to bond with our people and become militants. Okay. Meaning, every militant you see, every African militant you see, whether it's Thomas Sankara, whether it's Patrice Lumumba, John Magufuli, Nat Turner, there was some African woman in their lives who gave them the nurturance that they needed when they was a child, and that what that nurturance gave them was a self-definition, meaning they knew where they came from, so they didn't have this sense of insecurity when they was faced with threats, okay? So we have to understand breastfeeding is not just nutritional sufficiency, but emotionally and psychologically, it's the foundation for us to rear our children into militancy, meaning to rear them into an attitude that says, I'm not going to take any type of, opposition when it comes to defending my people. I'm not going to take any type of misinformation, propaganda, threats, when it comes to protecting what I was charged to protect. So next point, during slavery, breastfeeding of children was barred beyond a certain point because it was thought that it would lead to children running away from the plantation by the age of 7. So just imagine that our enslavers, they had such a good understanding of how crucial the black woman's breast was in terms of breastfeeding, that they had to put a limit on it, because they said if we allow this child to breastfeed at a certain point, that child is going to develop self-esteem. That child is going to develop a level of fearlessness where they're going to want to run away from the plantation. So the way you keep them on the plantation is you sever that bond that they have with the mother. Because if you sever that bond that they have with the mother, they won't have any self-identity, and we can implant the identity within them, okay? And this is how you create the Sambo. You create the Sambo, you have to say, okay, I have to sever the bond with the mother, and then in that gap, I insert, the character that can accommodate my needs as the slave master. All right. The next point, the period between birth and 6 years old is called the latching period. This is when the mother instills values in the child. Okay, so the latching period, this is supports this idea that you say the mother is the first and the most important teacher. That 6-year period, all the emotional, psychological, behavioral tendencies are being instilled in that child through that motherly care, through that maternal attention. The mother is doing that. But after that 6-year period, meaning when that child becomes 7, that's the period where the father is supposed to come in. Now, the mother doesn't leave entirely, but the father, at least if it's a son, now he's supposed to rear that child and guide him in the principles of manhood. Okay, and this is something that we're missing within Western societies, is this idea that we have a responsibility to guide our sons through that rites of passage, to guide them once they exited that latching period, to teach them, okay, all right, son, this is how, you should conceive of yourself as an adult. This is how you build. This is how you, solve problems. This is how you think critically. This is how you strategize. This is how you detect threats. This is what your enemy looks like. This is what your enemy smells like. This is what your enemy sounds like. This is what your enemy's children look like. This is what your enemy's ancestors look like. These are all things that fathers are supposed to teach their children once they exit that latching period, because now they're physically well enough, meaning they got that physical nourishment from the mother. Now we have to exercise their brain, exercise their mental muscles to say, okay, how can I get you to that next stage where you can be an asset to your people and your community? All right. So if anybody wants more information about that point about the children running away if they are breastfed, I would recommend they read the book. It's titled Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Child Rearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. And it was written by Sasha Turner, okay? And it was published in 2017. So I think it's available on ebook as well. So that's just a bibliographical note for those interested. All right, so this is a concept that I've been thinking about a lot today, and I think this really sharpens what I'm saying about the differences between an African or a black person in a Western environment and an African or a black person in an African environment, okay? And I call this the builder mentality versus the earner mentality, okay? Remember, the builder is the ancestor of all African men, meaning the builder is how we actualized our economic power. And what I'm arguing is that because we've been stolen from Africa, because we've been transplanted into the West, we've abandoned the mentality of the builder, and in its place, we substituted the mentality of the earner, okay? So I'm going to tell you what the builder is, and I'm going to tell you what the earner is, okay? So first, let's talk about the builder. So the builder is from our genetic memory. So traditions in Mali, the Swahili Coast, Kemet, Yorubaland, Benin, and Zimbabwe all speak to a culture of building among African men. What do I mean? So I mean, you had the Great Wall of Benin, you had the Mazimbabwe, or they call it the enclosure in Zimbabwe. You had shipping industries in Mali where we were selling from West Africa all the way to Panama. You had international trade between the Swahili Coast and China, where we were sending giraffes to China, to the imperial powers in China. You had instances of building enclosures and irrigation systems and bridges and roads. And notice all of these things, they weren't done for money. They were done in the sense of we're building out a nation. We're building out an infrastructure so that once this infrastructure is designed, all we have to do is bring our talents into this space, and we'll create wealth for ourselves. But today, because we don't control the infrastructure, because we aren't builders anymore, we've reduced ourselves to earners. Meaning now we define ourselves based on what is the size of our paycheck and not what we can construct. Not what is the quality of our vision, but what is the size of our bank accounts. You see? And these are all ways to feed into a westernized concept of manhood, because it doesn't really activate that part of us that says our first objective as men is to protect and to create shelter for our people, to build infrastructure for our people. Okay, so that's what I want to stress on the first point. Our tradition of building, and as builders, it originates on the African continent. Next, money is the currency of earners, but culture is the currency of builders, okay? Money is the currency of earners, culture is the currency of builders. So by that I mean, when we're talking about culture, culture is anything that contributes to your genetic survival, okay? Money doesn't contribute to our genetic survival. Money is only as useful as the ends you put it towards. But building, meaning if I were to build an irrigation system, if I were to build a solid home of stone, if I were to build a high wall that will protect us from enemy invaders, if I were to build, say, a canal so that we could transport goods from one place to another, these are all ways to assist in our genetic survival. Meanwhile, the earner, they're not as concerned about the genetic survival. They're concerned about how they're going to pay rent, how they're going to pay the bills, how they're going to pay their mortgage. And again, these are ways to confuse our manhood. So we have to understand when we're talking about building, we're talking about how can we contribute to the culture. When we're talking about earning, we're talking about how can we contribute to the culture of others, meaning the people who own the infrastructure. Okay. Next point. Men who elevate their earning power as the most important power are inevitably insecure. Okay, let me say that again. Men who elevate their earning power as their most important power are inevitably insecure. Money in America is a psychological tool. Okay, meaning a lot of men, the more money we have, the better we feel about ourselves. The less money we have, the less valuable we feel. And because of this distinction between value and non-value based on our money, we get this idea that if our earning power is compromised, our self-worth is compromised. And one of the problems about putting earning power and worth together is you'll never really earn enough. You'll always want more, meaning if you become a millionaire, now you want to become a multimillionaire. You become a multimillionaire, now you want to become a billionaire. You see, so we have to think of a way of asserting our power where it's not so much about the quantity but the quality. Meaning, am I making a secure path for my children to navigate? Am I making a secure path for my wife to navigate? Am I making a secure path for my lineage to expand across generations? You see, what kind of example am I setting? How will I be ritualized upon burial? You see, these are all ways of thinking beyond that earning power concept that we've been indoctrinated to thinking within the West, okay? Next, the courtship tradition of building a home for your wife before marriage shows how building is core to our self-definition as Black fathers. So in Africa, one of the ways we pay a bride price is you say, okay, you want to marry this woman, build her a house, okay? And why did they make you build a house before you marry? Because they said, I don't know what the quality of your manhood is until I know what your quality is as a builder. You see, not as an earner, but a builder, okay? So that courtship system, again, is institutionalizing a concept of manhood that we've been ripped from, okay? Next, and this is more current today, the Earn Your Leisure and other finance-based podcasts and organizations and people are designed to make Black men passive, okay? Which means passive income. You know, we hear this a lot. Make your money work for you. Don't work for money. You should have multiple streams of income, okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with getting money, but when we start glorifying this idea of getting money passively, meaning getting money without really contributing anything to society, this is a way to effeminize men. Because remember, the woman is the receiver, the man is the giver. And passivity is feminine, meaning as men, we should not be taking pride in passive income. We should be taking pride in saying, what are we building to protect and project our power so that our lineage, so that our offspring can have it better than we had, okay? So this idea of passive income and this earn your leisure, I want luxury life, I want a soft life, all of this is a way to destroy that building gene that the original African man had, okay? And this is also a way to turn us into gentlemen, okay? To disown that active agent that we have, that impulse to create out of nothing, that impulse to erect monuments and structures and temples and roads and, you know, all of that, it gets undermined when we start thinking about that earning power as opposed to that building power, okay? Next, the Ma'afa made us look at building as degrading and not empowering. And Ma'afa just means our period of enslavement in the West, okay? Meaning when we were forced to build the nation for Yorugu, that made it so that we didn't want to build anything for ourselves because now in our brain, we made the association hard labor equals degradation. Meanwhile, in Africa, building was an act of ritual. Building was a form of reverence, you see? So we've made building and the very act of putting our hands to the ground, we've made that something that's not valued anymore. So now instead of building for our people, we say, oh no, we don't want to build. We want luxury. We don't want to build. We want passive income. We want multiple streams of income while not being able to make the sacrifice, okay? And that's the last point I want to make is we only become builders when we develop the courage to make sacrifice. And that means shared sacrifice, meaning we're going to lose money, meaning we're going to make enemies, meaning people aren't going to like us. You see, but this is what men who are solid in their manhood do. They say, I'm doing this out of principle. I'm doing this because I have a vision that transcends the kind of narrow focus of a Western society that's decaying, you see? Because remember, the West is decaying, so there hasn't been a better time than to assert your Africanness than now, okay? And this is something my wife and I, we have long-term for us in the future is we don't want to continuously live, you know, in this kind of westernized way where we're constantly worrying about money coming in. We're constantly worrying about, you know, what's the next bill? What's the next rent? No, we want to say, how can we create a situation where I, as a man, can build the infrastructure that will help my family, and my wife, as the mother of the home, she can curate, meaning she can add vitality to those spaces that I build so that our children can eat and all our people can eat. Okay, and this is something long term we have. We want to engage in villagehood, you know, meaning it's not enough for us to just be on the continent, but living in a way that is, you know, very similar to the ways that we lived in the West. We have to move off, you know, the grid, so to speak, and get into areas where we can really get in touch with our African essence. All right. So that's the builder-earner distinction. All right. So quickly next, there's an article, and I'll just reference this because a lot of the articles and books that I'm referencing, they're lengthy, but I think if you all read them, you'll get a deeper appreciation. There's an academic article is published in the Journal of Negro Education, and it was called How Black Mothers Participate in the Development of Manhood and Masculinity. What do we know about black mothers and their sons? So the point of this article is basically showing how in America, you have single black mothers who are raising sons alone, but what they discover is that there's fundamentally no difference in how single black women raise black boys versus how men raise black boys, which tells me that as men from the West, we don't really have a unique contribution in terms of how we raise our sons. So, and I feel that's problematic because remember, in the African context where the men were tasked with organizing the rites of passage, we had that unique contribution. So I would invite, you know, my brothers, the ones at least who are logged in, what do you think our unique contribution is to manhood development? Meaning this is something that only we could do, but our wives can't do, that the mothers of our children can't do. You see, because I think whatever that is, that's that part of us that we have to work on expanding the most, okay? And lastly, I want to communicate that America doesn't provide the space for us to be useful, okay? America does not provide the space for us to be useful. Again, I'm talking about who is building the nation and what is the vision behind the builders, meaning the way that America is designed for the African man to fail. Okay, think about the movie They Clone Tyrone. Okay, that was the subtext of that whole movie. You living in a lab, you're living in a controlled environment to where even if you have the principles, even if you have the knowledge, even if you have the foresight, until you decide to exit that laboratory, you're always going to fulfill the goal of that lab technician, whoever is in charge of that lab. Okay. So America doesn't provide space for us to be useful. And we find our usefulness in Africa because environment is key, meaning who we are is shaped by our environment, okay? And when we discover what makes us useful, what we also discover is self-esteem. Because self-esteem isn't just how you feel about yourself. Self-esteem is how you perceive what your contribution is to your people. Meaning if you take all responsibility away from a people, if you teach people that it's not in their job to be sovereign and you teach them to be dependent, they're inevitably going to have low self-esteem because our esteem is only built insofar as we're fulfilling our responsibilities. So again, environment is key, and we have to be in Africa in order to understand our usefulness as black men. All right, so next point. So now we're going to talk about contemporary causes of confused manhood. And contemporary, that just means things that are still going on as I speak, okay? Meaning these aren't the ancient things. These aren't like the things that happened back in the 1800s. These are things that are happening right now. So one, the glorification of non-African or Eurocentric women has alienated from us from our complements, which is African women, okay? Meaning this rejection of African women, the rejection of dark-skinned women, the rejection of the African phenotype, thick hair, all of the things that make African women, when we reject those things, we're rejecting our power. Because remember, our power is what? In that balanced dynamic between the man and the woman. It's not individualist, it's communal, okay? Meaning as long as we're disconnected from the African woman, we're going to be disconnected from our power as African men, all right? Next point, the growth of homosocial environments, such as prisons, military camps, sports teams, Greek fraternities, etc., as the primary environment for self-definition. Meaning, homosocial means it's only one gender in this environment. So whenever you talk about militaries, prisons, sports teams, fraternities, and it's a bunch of men and you don't see any women, the likelihood of homosexuality entering into that space is high, and this also corrupts our self-definition. Because remember, from an African point of view, our self-definition as men was connected to our definition as fathers. And you can't be a father if you're homosexual. You see, you can't procreate with a man. You can only procreate with a woman. So you have to understand the growth of homosocial environments within Western societies especially, because remember, Western society, they come from a heritage of homosexuality, is a precursor, or I would say a risk factor for confused manhood. Next point, the normalization of homosexuality in media, education, music, and concepts of familyhood. And this just expands on my previous point. Again, you cannot have a culture that is championing homosexuality, that is convincing you to reject your procreative power and then still not be confused in your manhood. In order to be clear in your manhood, you have to also champion your procreative power, and champion it with intentionality, meaning you don't procreate with anybody, but you do it in a context of rights, courtship, and commitment, meaning you marry the woman first, okay? These are all ways of preserving our manhood as opposed to allowing it to be confused, all right? Next point, you have integration into corporate America and consumption of white cultural delivery systems. And one of the main cultural delivery systems of white society is what I call FIRE entrepreneurship. FIRE is an acronym. It means finance, insurance, and real estate. So this is the Invest Fest, this is the Earn Your Leisure, this is the Killer Mikes, this is the Greenwoods. These are all the financial literacy campaigns that we see sprouting up as a way to get black people to maximize their earning power. Not their building power, their earning power. Meaning we're not building infrastructure for our family to shelter under. We're not building infrastructure for nations to emerge. No, we want to cut in on predominantly white industries that have locked us out by law. You see, like when we're talking about the real estate industry, this is a white industry where they have racial covenants where they locked us out by law. So why would we possibly want to integrate into that system unless we saw an individual gain to be had and not a collective gain? So FIRE entrepreneurship is one of the ways in which black men in the West are kept in perpetual confusion about their manhood. And that's attached to what I call the breadwinner mentality. Meaning when you're in a family, especially if you're married, there's no such thing as a breadwinner. Because every dollar you earn, that's a dollar the family has earned. Every dollar your wife earned, that's a dollar the family has earned. When you start getting territorial about money within a marriage, within the household, that's a sign of confused manhood, because you're attaching value to that money psychologically that it doesn't deserve. Your value as a man is in your value as a builder, not as a breadwinner. As a builder, not a breadwinner, okay? Next, the absence of heterosexual black male teachers in our educational environments. And I feel I'm contributing to increase the presence of heterosexual black men in our educational environments. Because remember, the vast majority of black boys, when they go to school, their teachers are female. They're either white women or black women. And I definitely think black women are better, but at some point, the black boy needs a black male teacher, because what the black male teacher does is he teaches that child that black men are intelligent, that black men aren't just for paying bills and doing trivial things. No, we actually know how to use our minds and think strategically. One of the most beautiful things I think I've witnessed since we've moved to the continent is how my son has been introduced to so many African male teachers. And on the continent, it's not unusual for men to be teachers. We've toured schools here on the continent, and we've gone through faculty rooms, and we've seen the room full of men, full of fathers. You see, so when you can have a father teach you as a young black boy, that's going to revolutionize how you think about yourself. Because you say, well, if a black man can teach me, well, I can be a teacher. You see? So we have to understand part of resuscitating a healthy, a holistic idea of manhood is we have to start celebrating heterosexual black male teachers in our educational environments. Next, Christian indoctrination and the homosexualization of the church. Okay, so this can be a whole video, but I'm just going to quickly say, when we're talking about Christianity, remember, they remove what? The divine mother. And remember what I said at the beginning. As African men, in order for us to secure our power, we have to have that feminine presence to what? Balance us. Okay, once you remove that feminine presence, you breed confusion. Meaning you breed Greece, you breed Rome. So in the Christian indoctrination, what you have is this inability to truly honor the divine mother. And because the divine mother is not honored, we remain confused in our manhood. And this is also a factor in the homosexualization of the church, you know, where you have people, homosexuals on average, make more money than heterosexuals. And they use this money to pay tithes to then control the church programming, to control the church policy. Okay. And this is again expounded on in Baruti's book, Homosexuality and the Feminization of Black Males. And lastly, one of the contemporary causes of confused manhood is no rites of passage. And current data shows there's no difference in how women and men relate to their sons. Okay, and I already talked about that. So we need a rites of passage program for our boys. Okay, even if you're not initiated, you have to give them that passageway. Otherwise, they're going to transition from adolescence into adulthood, and they're going to continue acting like adolescents. Because you didn't ceremonialize it. You have to show, I place value on your status as a man. So, and I place value on that by what? Ceremonializing it. By bringing the community, by bringing the village in, by having everyone celebrate your transition into manhood. Because when you don't do that, they're not going to value it, you see? Because they say, my community doesn't value it, so why should I value it, okay? So that's very important. All right, so I'm nearing the end. I hope everyone is still there with me. So I'm on point number 5 now. Point number 5 is how sports culture confuses our manhood. So this was a kind of tricky topic for me because growing up, I was very athletic. I played baseball, I played basketball in the neighborhood and in recreational leagues. And sports, in fact, was one of the ways I bonded the most with my brother and my father. You know, we would watch football, we would watch basketball, we play football, play basketball. So all these sports, for me, it was like I think I had a sentimental attachment to it. But I think once we start to think with our African mind, you will start to discover how sports culture, especially in the West, is used as a tool to confuse our manhood. Okay? So how is sports used as a tool to confuse our manhood? So, one, through professional sports, we are taught that white men are not our enemies, but our teammates, our coaches, and our owners, okay? Any environment where you're compelled by the rules of that environment to cooperate with your enemies, that's an environment designed to what? Disempower you. It's designed to keep you in a state of subordination, okay? And when we're talking about sports and the ownership of sports, it's overwhelmingly white. So again, subconsciously, when we consume a lot of this sports media and sports entertainment, we're being taught that people who are our enemies are actually our allies, okay? Second, sports is designed to conceal the race war between white and black fans through race pride, okay? So this is just an extension of what happens to the athletes. It also happens to the black fans, meaning if you go to a sporting event, you look at the crowd, it's all colors, black, white, Asian, and we all high-fiving because our team just scored a touchdown. Yet when we get in the parking lot, now we looking sideways, we locking doors, you see? So this it gives you a facade of harmony, I think, that sports is designed to do. And that's, again, another reason how it can confuse us in our manhood, because part of being men is being able to detect threats and to act aggressively against those threats, okay? Next, sports culture projects a false image of black male success as separate from their roles as husbands and fathers, okay? This feeds into that earning power as opposed to the building power. And one way I saw this in sports was, if you all know the basketball star Kawhi Leonard. You know, Kawhi Leonard, very humble man, very quiet, won a championship with the Toronto Raptors, but very reserved, very modest. And a lot of times when they'll show him, he'll be spending time with his wife and children. And what that's done is it made people make memes about him. Say, this guy's weird. What's wrong with him? How come he ain't at the club? How come he ain't, in music videos with Drake and LeBron? Like, how come he ain't doing Nike commercials left and right? You see, because Kawhi Leonard, he probably has a value that says, I define myself based on how my children think of me. I define myself based on how my wife thinks of me. I don't need the kind of empty praise of a bunch of white fans. I don't need the empty praise of a media culture that is obsessed with building profits for profit's sake. So again, this Kawhi Leonard situation, this again shows how within that sports culture, what they want is they want the black male to begin to define himself in ways that doesn't involve his children or his wife. Next, sports culture harvests and safely redirects our aggressive energy for non-militant ends, okay? Meaning consumerism, alcoholism, and American nationalism, okay? All these athletes, these big, hulking athletes on the field, these men in the African society will probably be part of the warrior class, okay? They'll be doing guerrilla warfare against any invaders. But again, the purpose of the sports culture is to pacify the black man, meaning to preserve his body but take his mind, to quote the Willie Lynch letter, okay? So sport culture harvests and safely redirects our aggressive energy for non-militant ends. And we have to begin asking ourselves as men, this is something we can brainstorm on. In what ways are we channeling our militant energy in order to advance our culture? Meaning the fact that we have muscle mass, how are we using that against our enemies? Are we just using it to dunk basketballs? Or are we doing it to hurt our enemies? Okay, that's an important thing to address, at least if we're talking about African concepts of manhood. And lastly, sports culture discourages intellectual depth and social consciousness among its athletes in favor of gentle giants, okay? So just think about Kyrie Irving versus Shaquille O'Neal, okay? So Kyrie Irving, this is a man of intellectual depth. He says, okay, I'm a Hebrew Israelite. I don't necessarily agree with that, but he's thinking, he's online, he's researching, he's speaking his mind. He's talking about how African people are the original people. You see, so all of this is a level of intellectual searching that people within a sporting environment aren't used to. So what do they get to neutralize Kyrie Irving? Shaquille O'Neal, oh, he's an idiot. Kyrie Irving, yeah, he's an idiot because he's talking about, how Jewish people white Jewish people are imposters and how the original Jews are black, you see? But if we had a culture where manhood was intact within sports, what you would have had is Shaquille O'Neal is like, you know what? Even though I don't understand my brother, I like the fact that he's bringing an intellectual discussion in a place where we're normally focused on, just dunking basketball and getting triple doubles, you see? So again, whenever you see this kind of intense kind of effort to silence any type of intellectual inquiry, this is a sign of confused manhood, okay? So we're coming to the finish line. So part 6, or point number 6, okay? Solution, the African concept of manhood, okay? So we come in full circle. We done talked about the history. We talked about contemporary versions of confused manhood. We talked about sports. We talked about homosexuality, all of that. So at the end, what is the solution? What is the African concept of manhood? And so I'm going to list out just 4 points of what the African concept of manhood is. And I invite the viewers to just drop in their definition of African manhood, because I think this is how we develop new ideas. We come together, we collaborate, okay? Like Fela say, it's time to put our heads together, you see? All right? So first solution, an African man is the end product of a boy consistently breastfed, compassionately reared by an African community, and guided through a rites of passage by a group of initiated African men and elders, okay? So meaning we never leave the circle. From the moment of birth, from the moment of that naming ceremony, to the moment of us being breastfed, to the moment of us being through the rites of passage, to the moment of us getting married, to the moment of us becoming elders, to the moment of us being ritually buried, you see, to the moment of us coming back again, you see, all of that's a ritual. So to be an African man is to live your life ritualistically, meaning you never leave that circle. You're constantly defining yourself by the quality of your relationship with your people, with your children, with your wife, with everyone else in the village. Next point. African men define themselves as fathers first. When they access their innermost power, the benefit is shared by the family, okay? Meaning, we know we're operating in a healthy form of manhood when we engage in activity and our family eats because we did that thing. And it's not even necessarily a monetary transaction, meaning it could be something as simple as we gave them an idea. We built some type of structure that protected them from something that would have, possibly destroyed them. You see, so we define ourselves as fathers, and our power is defined by the effect on those we care and love about. Okay, and one of the anthropological, I think, sources for this is a book I have with me here, and it's titled Intimate Fathers, okay? And the subtitle is The Nature and Context of Aka Pygmy Paternal Infant Care, okay? And this is one of the books that I used heavily as an inspiration for the father trimester. So the Aka people, they're known as Twa. Pygmy is a derogatory term, but they're actually called the Twa people, and they live in the Congo, and they're unique in the world because unlike Western fathers, they spend 47% of their time with their children. They wear their children. They bathe their children. They know how to soothe their children when they're crying. They think fatherhood is intrinsically valuable, which is important because he contrasts that with what he calls fathers who are obsessed with status maintenance, meaning I'm going to hug my child because you're looking, but I'm not going to hug the child because I see intrinsic value in this. Okay, so this is an aspect, Asante.
Karibu, baby.
This is an aspect of the Aka, or the African concept of fatherhood, is we see intrinsic value in fatherhood, and we show that intrinsic value in how we provide care to our children, okay? How we protect our children, all right? The third solution is African men respect African women, our complementarity, and detest homosexuality and whites as threats to ordered living. Notice I said detest. I didn't say, you do what you want to do over there, just keep it away from me. No, African men say, strong men who are holistic, they say, my concept of manhood isn't just for me. The concept of manhood defines our culture. Meaning if I allow homosexuality, if I allow degradation of women, it's going to spread. It's going to be like a disease because now we've normalized it. We've normalized it as a standard. So we have to be courageous and say, we don't care if somebody calls us homophobic. We don't care if somebody says, oh, that's hateful. Because our ancestors told us that this was the way they ordered society. And I have enough faith in my ancestors to know that if I follow the path that they laid out, I'm going to get to where I need to go. Okay? So African men respect African women and detest homosexuality and whites as threats to ordered living. All right? And lastly, African men see it as their number one priority to spiritually and physically build for and protect their wife and children, and to bond their children to the culture of their ancestors, okay? So all of this is how you transmit the culture to your children. You know, among the Aka people, they say the child inherits the blood from the mother and the spirit from the father. They call it the Sun. That's the spirit of the father. And they even say that if a child is deprived of the father's presence, he becomes what they call a spiritual delinquent, okay? Meaning you have no direction, you have no anchorage, okay? You have no real base upon which to project power because your father didn't give you that kind of discipline, that kind of self-direction that you needed, okay? So what we have to understand is part of our task as the spiritual guardians of our family is to bond our children to the culture of their ancestors. And that's why we moved to Africa. We wanted to bond our children with their ancestors. We wanted to bond Jahi with his ancestors. We wanted to give him an African name. We wanted to raise him around African children, teach him African languages. You see, this is how you bond your children with their ancestors, and there's no protective agent more effective than the culture that a people come from. That's how you protect the people. The culture is our immune system, all right? So I hope you all will stay with me through this video. As you can tell, very passionate. And we could talk a lot more about this. So I'm excited to see, what kind of questions and inquiries I get from this. I will be saving this live. So if you want to share it with someone, once it's over. Feel free to do so we can expand the discussion and just, drop, any questions you have. But lastly, before I leave, I want to give a call to action, because without a call to action, we're just doomed to repeat the same mistakes that we always do. So the call to action is black men must leave America and see the benefits of leaving America, okay? Now, this is something that is very difficult for us to think about, because, again, if we grew up in a society where we're socialized to think our power is in our earning potential, our role as a father is only as valuable as we can provide and not build, that Africans aren't really our ancestors, that they somehow betrayed us, this is a narrative that's popping up, then we're not going to access our manhood. So to access our manhood, we have to put ourselves in an environment that's natural to us, meaning we have to put ourselves in an environment where the roots of our manhood are in the soil, and that environment is Africa. When you come here and you're a father, they will call you Baba. When you come here and you see children, the children will say Shkamo, which means I respect you. And I was talking about that today. Imagine in the West, if every time you saw a child, whether you knew that child or not, that child looked at you and said, I respect you. What would that do to your self-concept as a man? Even if you was slipping, even if you was messing up, even if you was just in a position where you was just failing and being negligent in fulfilling your responsibilities. To have a child tell you that they respect you, that's supposed to awaken something in us. That's the child saying, I trust you. Even if you're imperfect, I trust you because you're an African. And then you respond to that child. You say, Maraba, which means I accept your respect. Okay? But that can only be experienced on the African continent. That's not going to happen in America. That's not going to happen in the land of human trafficking. That's not going to happen in the land of mass shootings. That's not going to happen in the land of unaccompanied minors. That's not going to happen, you see, in the land of child sex trade. That's not going to happen, in the line of homeless children, you see. So when we're talking about America versus Africa, that's a competition between a non-child-centered society and a child-centered society. And my argument is, if we want to manifest our power as African men, we have to be in environments where children are centered, because it's in those environments that our protective power is going to be tested the most, okay? So we have to leave America. This is not an option. This is a necessity, okay? We have to leave America, all right? And lastly, I just want to encourage my brothers, new fathers, and fathers, anticipating becoming fathers, even if you already got adult children, but you're thinking deeper about, what I could have done differently as a father. I encourage you to purchase my book, The Father Trimester. It's available in ebook on our website, witnessourdivine.com. And in this book, again, I talk about how we as fathers can reclaim that builder's mentality, that mentality that says, my value as a man transcends what I get every 2 weeks. My value as a man transcends the size of my house or the size of my car, but my value as a man is innate in my ability to create, to protect the perimeter so that my complement, my wife, can curate for our children, okay? That's what it means to be rooted in African manhood. And there's plenty of other classes on the site, so we taught a class on child rearing called Nkisi, and I also have a webinar, and the webinar is titled How to Support the Mothers of Our Children in the Perinatal Period. And this webinar is a good companion piece to go along with that, the Father Trimester book, all right? So, Asante Sana, I appreciate it's a lively comment section. I may try to look briefly through the comments because I noticed there's a lot, and I appreciate those people who's patient enough to listen to me and to trust me, because I think these are the type of conversations we have to have as a collective if we truly want to overcome, the crisis that we find ourselves in. So Brother I Am Uhuru says the African man is the spiritual leader and protector of his family. Ashe, I agree. I Am Pretty CC says, yeah, my BD swear he's showing our daughter love when it just make him feel better. I know he loves her though. Yeah, that status maintenance, we have to understand there's a difference between loving your child when you're visible and actually investing in your child's growth, okay? meaning we want to take a mentality of, I'm doing this for your growth, because love grows you. You see, love isn't supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to grow you from the inside out, okay? So, and how we relate to our children and our spouses, we have to understand, are we giving them the proper stimulus for growth? Because if that growth stimulus isn't there, then we have to go back and question it. Is this really love, or is this romance, or is this love bombing, or is this some other type of, manipulation? Okay, Jones says, that's why being at home in a hetero environment is strange. Yeah, Ashe, sister. Sports culture and homosexuality as well, yes. Urban Author says, black manhood in the context of a white racially oppressive system has become suppressed and near obsolete. I agree. And Francis Welsing, Articulated Connection with Sports. Yes, that's another book I urge you all to read. The ISIS Papers by Francis Cress Welsing, where she talks about the symbolism of balls and how whites, they express their genetic anxiety through sports. So it's a lot of good comments. Again, Asante Sana for being patient and tuning into this. And again, once I repost this on my page, please drop questions so we can continue this conversation, because we have to get our families to safety. But that's going to begin when we as men start to assert our role as the first and most important protectors. All right? Abibi Fahodie.